And hello, everybody, and welcome to Presence. I am Doug King, and I'm very excited to continue this really important study on the biblical narrative as holomovement. We are in the middle of this, and as we go along, what we're going to do is slowly build layer by layer by layer to show how science and the biblical narrative combine to tell the very same story. And further, what we're saying is that when you use the first narrative ever given, which is our universe, in the beginning, from source, came a narrative, came from source a universe full of universal principles built on interconnectivity, relationality, wholeness, oneness, inseparability. Those elements should be a part of anyone's narrative when we're talking about that which we might call God. That's the term used by the biblical narrative, or spirit or spirituality. All those elements should add up. And if someone has an outcome that is antithetical to those things, meaning an outcome where you have separation, for example, then we should know that that actually goes against the very nature of God. For we know that God's first narrative, first story, is the universe itself. And I'm going to build on that. As a matter of fact, I'm going to go to some charts today, and I want to start by layering back on the holomovement. What is the holomovement? Because I know this is new to many of you. And so I want to take our time in this series. I want to go through all these charts carefully, and you will see what a dramatic and radical impact this makes on where we stand with regard to the interpretation of the biblical narrative in the year now 2024. And that we are proposing, we are at a place in history where we are now ready for a radical and dramatic departure from old 2,000-year paradigms that have been handed down and that are not working. And in fact, we're seeing the ways in which they're not working on many levels in many different places. So what I'm going to do is I am going to now move to the charts, and I'm going to see if I can share a chart here. And presto, there's a chart. So this is where I'm beginning. I just want to point out again where we started, holomovement, and the unfolding and informing process to begin with. There's two things that are happening in the middle of this Venn diagram. The first one is an informing process, meaning that you have a source, and that source is formless. God is formless. From that formless source, there then is manifested a universe of forms and things. And this is, of course, what quantum physics is saying is the case, and which has been proven, is that the universe came into existence through a process of informing that produced formations or forms. And the last episode we had was with Dr. Jude Currivan, and she pointed out that the entire universe is built upon information, and information is that which would be associated with consciousness. So when we're talking about what is the holomovement, the holomovement is a two-part movement. This is very important because when we go to the biblical narrative, we'll see these same two elements, and they're going to accomplish the very same thing in the realms of spirituality that are accomplished in the formation of our literal universe, and that both of them are therefore reflective of the nature of God. So, right in the middle, you have two things happening, and I'm showing the first, and that is the unfolding of our universe, bringing it into existence, was an informing process. Now, quantum physics, David Bohm, back in the last century specifically, was the one who coined the terms implicate order and explicate order. And so the implicate order is that which transcends our universe. Bohm was able to show that in the explicate order, you have forms and things, and all of them are subject to time and space, like the speed of light. The speed of light is that which is responsible for defining time and space. However, Bohm showed, and it has further been proven in quantum experimentation, that two particles can be separated by thousands of light years and yet react at the very same time, thus indicating that there is an order actually behind the explicate order that is affecting the explicate order beyond time and space. This is the space that we're saying, this implicate space, will relate to the space of that which is called God. And so the implicate order manifests and produces everything that's in the explicate order. So the implicate order is that which is greater. Jesus recognized that. We'll talk about that more at length as we go along in the series. Now, what else is involved as we go along here with the Holomovement as narrative? Here, we're talking about the enfolding process, which is back toward consciousness. It moves from form in the explicate order back toward the implicate order. How does it move from form back to formlessness? It does so by transform. Transforming is the other principle right here in the middle of the Venn diagram. Transforming is the other movement. So you have informing, by which the universe comes into existence. And then in the realm of form, which we will talk about at great length, in the realm of form, there is then movement through the human being when form becomes internalized in our worldviews and our interpretations. Form then heads back toward God, which is to say, it heads back toward the implicate order, and it can only do so through a process of transform. So in the middle of the Venn, you have both a movement of informing and transforming. Therefore, a narrative informs for the purpose of transforming. So, right here, we will see that we use the Venn diagram to show that our universe is interconnected and that its identity is going to be found in the implicate realm, and that when we get out to forms and things, that realm will be related to diversity. Diversity is real. Diversity exists as something necessary to our universe. It has role and function, though it is not identity. And again, when we then bring the biblical narrative in and overlay it on this very same Venn diagram with these very same elements of informing and transforming, we will see that to differentiate between form and formlessness is to differentiate between our identity versus things with which we have role and function. And we'll talk about that a great deal more. So, what goes in the middle of this, if we're using this from a biblical narrative standpoint? This is where Christology is. This is going to be our radical and dramatic differentiation between the 2,000-year-old handed down paradigm that I've got a chart on here I'll show in just a moment, and what we're saying we're now ready to understand, just as we have been now ready to understand things in quantum physics that were not known before in the Newtonian world. Now, for example, in the middle, if I put Christology in the middle of this, the biblical narrative will talk about an implicate order and it will talk about an explicate order. And in the explicate order, you're going to have a realm of forms. We'll talk about the forms of the explicate order in our next episode. And those forms then required a process of transform. And that's what, so Christology is all about transforming. And so if I look at what we've had, here's Christology today. Christology today is telling this story. This is the story Christology says. Yes, there was a world of form, the world of Moses, etc., etc. And we're going to go through all those forms in our next episode. But then there's the cross, excuse me. And then what comes into being is a new form called Christianity. And the new form of Christianity displaces the old form of Moses. You have a New Testament, whereas those in the Mosaic order have an old one. And there is no interconnectivity here. You can see these two circles are separated. And through the years, through the last 2,000 years, this separation that is a paradigm handed down has caused a tremendous amount of problems, even violence, between these two forms. And there has been, especially in times past, the teachings, and in many of the fundamentalist groups of Christianity today, that the Mosaic form, of course, has been done away with, or it's inferior, etc., etc. So we've got to address that. What we're saying is that if you look at biblical cosmology, Christology is right in the middle, and it's connecting the movement from the explicate order into the implicate order. But that means that form has a role and function in the explicate under Moses. Transform has a role and function in Christology and its first century work. And both Moses and Jesus walk side by side as role and function in order to deliver humanity into the formless realm, or what's called a new heaven and earth, or a new age, or the world to come, using language from the biblical narrative. And therefore, Moses and Jesus are both pointing away from themselves to that which is identity. And remember, identity is found through source. What is source? Source is God. And this is why human identity and universe identity is God identity. And this is how God becomes all in all. God is all in all in the realm of form, and yet above all, meaning that God is beyond time and space. So God is all in everything that is our universe, as well as beyond our universe. So narratives in general, well, they convey meaning, but meaning is subject to interpretation. It's interesting that Paul, for example, when he wrote to the Colossians, he makes this statement. He says, all things are held together in Christ. Now, if Paul were presenting to a group of physicists, he could just as well have said to them, all things are held together by the Holomovement, meaning that the Holomovement is that which interconnects both the implicate and explicate realms, that they are both held together. All things are held together by the Holomovement. When we go to this interpretation of Christology, which displaces the old interpretation of Christology, we see that all things are held together in Christ, or Christology. Christ is not Jesus's last name. Christ is a role and function of informing and transforming. We will talk at greater length about how Christology both informs as well as transforms. So, we're proposing this interpretation of Christology and saying that the old interpretation that we have here is a Newtonian interpretation that's purely a realm of form. It's resulted in separation. It is defined by denominating. What is the new form? It's called Christianity. What does it do? It denominates, it separates. We have to remember that it is a form. Forms are boundary driven. Division can only happen in the realm of form. You cannot have division in the realm of the formless. There can be no division in the formless. So there are thousands of interpretations of Christology. Look at all the denominations that are out there now. What are they based on? Thousands of different interpretations of Christology all over the board. So the question is, whose interpretation of the biblical narrative is correct? How do we know which interpretation of the biblical narrative is correct? The problem has been that Christianity is a closed system. Rather than using the God narrative of our universe, the God narrative of the Holomovement, Christianity purely stays inside of itself. And so when you do that, you're in these endless loops where they're constantly arguing with each other, constantly disagreeing with each other over what is the definition of Christianity, what is the definition of the church. Well, there is no such thing as the church. There's only thousands of iterations of what people disagree about the church. So that is what is produced, whereas we're proposing that God's Holomovement story, God's Holomovement narrative is validating our interpretation. And our interpretation is that Christology is transform. It is not a form. It is not a new form. Rather, it is transform. And what is the end result? What's its outcome? It's not a religion. It is universal God identity because source determines identity. What is the source of all, including all humans? God. And so we're proposing that rather than religion, this is going to be a trans-religious approach to the biblical narrative. We're not eliminating Christology. We're reinterpreting Christology. And for people that might say, wait a minute, what do you mean you're reinterpreting Christology? We're doing what's been going on for 2,000 years because Christology has been reinterpreted over and over and over again. And that's how you got all these different denominations. We're saying that by using science as an outside source to validate our interpretation of the narrative, that we have an alignment of the two, that this Venn diagram perfectly aligns with our interpretation of the biblical narrative, and what physics and quantum physics tell us is the Holomovement narrative. They are, in fact, identical. So we are not excluding Christology. We are proposing an interpretation that goes beyond what I consider to be a little God that only applies to this small group or that small group. And even if we said God applied to everyone that called themselves a Christian, whether they were a mainline Presbyterian, Methodist, although the Methodist Church is now split into two different groups. There we go. Amish, Mormon, I can go down the list. Even if we said all of them represent Christianity, they are still only a small percentage, a lesser percentage of God's entire creation. And that to me is the story of little God. And so this is the state of where we are today. So in the Holomovement, you have groups like the evolutionary leaders. I've talked to you about them. They have actually proposed that which they call a unitive narrative. And for them, they are seeing spirituality as source, that there is a source behind this universe, but it does not tell the story of divided religions. The Holomovement is not religious. Quantum physics is not religious. The universe is not religious. Religions have been forms that have been interpretations of narratives. So we are separating narratives from religious interpretations. Here's what I mean by that. I keep the biblical narrative all the way through and everything that I'm talking about. However, my interpretation of the narrative does not result in a religious form. So that's our proposal, and that these things must align, and that's how this works when we're going through the Holomovement, and why it's important to see these two narratives are telling the same story. The Holomovement is narrative and the biblical narrative. Both of them represent God's creative action. That's another term I'd use for the middle of the Venn here. The middle of the Venn is God's creative action. That's the Holomovement, and that is also the creative movement that we see in the biblical narrative, that both informs and creates the realm of form and then transforms through that which is the role and function of Christology. So this is what we're proposing. And I want to talk now just a little bit about this idea of form and informing. Let's back up to it. This is where we are right now. We're going to move to transform later, but remember, the universe starts through an informing process. So how does that? So we know this applies to the universe. This is what Jude told us. Look, the universe is built on information. She further said that if you go to the Planck scale, you will find the smallest things measurable in our universe, such as quantum pixels. And she explained that a quantum pixel is built on information, but that a quantum pixel is in size to an atom what an atom is to the entire universe. That's mind-blowing. That's mind-blowing to me. So she is saying, from the very most minute, measurable thing in our universe, before you go beyond that, you end up with what? No things. This is what's fascinating. From no things come things, meaning from nothing comes this manifestation that science is now saying is indicating a conscious universe. For a long time, people have been familiar with the statement, thoughts become things. That's literally what the quantum realm is illustrating for us, showing to us. So, how did this informing process, how is it told in the biblical narrative, the informing process? In John 1:1, John said, in the beginning was Logos, Word. What is Word related to? Word is related to information. In the beginning was information, information was God. Word, Logos, has no gender. It is not a he, even though interpretations may call it he in order to support one of the creeds and important doctrines to many of the Christian organizations, the doctrine of Trinity. This is not a Trinitarian concept. Logos is information. Now, that information was conveyed in a variety of different ways. For example, the writer of Hebrews says that God in times past spoke, that's information, spoke to us through the prophets, but now in these last days has spoken to us, informed us through his Son, through the Son. So Christ and the Christology role is Logos, absolute Logos, but Logos in the sense of being a servant to God's informing process. And from the very beginning of the narrative, the idea of communicating or informing was from Genesis 1:1. God in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and God said, "Let there be light." That is an informing phrase. God said, God spoke. When we look at the story of Adam, Adam was understanding there were certain things that were coming from source, that which is called God, and Adam therefore was being informed about that which he could and could not do. When we go to the other part of the Genesis story, that's Abraham. God is calling Abraham. Abraham is hearing the informing voice of God. God is giving Abraham information. You are to go out into a place I will show you. That's information. That information is guidance. So we're now seeing that the biblical narrative is starting with Adam and Abraham, and that the whole creation itself is starting with informing, just as informing Abraham and Adam. God informs this universe. And as the story unfolds, and this is an unfolding process in the biblical narrative, just like the universe was an unfolding process, God will then show up and inform Moses, call Moses. Moses will have an informing experience, and that informing experience will lead him to his appropriate role and function. When we read about David, this is literally said in the biblical narrative by David. The word of the Lord came to me saying. This is, again, the conveyance of information. What was the information that David got? It was that he was not to build this temple that he wanted for God, but rather his son would build the temple. And the reason given was that David, as king, had conquered Israel's enemies and had shed a lot of blood. And for that reason, he was informed that he would not be the one to build the temple. There are several of the prophets who used the same language. And the word of the Lord came to me saying, this is the prophets as part of the informing process. Again, that is the way the Holomovement began. Its first movement was an informing process. This is the movement of source in the biblical narrative, which is called God. There were other ways that informing happened. So, for example, in dreams, you have Jacob's ladder, and you have the story of Daniel, who was an interpreter of dreams. And these dreams were informing in the sense that they provided meaningful content. They had meaning. And so people came to Daniel to find out what the meaning of these dreams were. So you have prophets that have visions. You have Moses and Abraham and David who have God experiences. All of them are part of this meaningful information, meaning an informing process. So you also have this end result of a universe full of forms. The forms in our universe are stars, planets, solar systems, galaxies, on and on, all the way till you get to the planet Earth. And in the planet Earth, there are all types of biological forms. There are forms in the oceans, on the land, in the air, leading all the way up to the biological form of the human. And we humans also have existence in the realm of form via the form of our biological bodies. So that's how form works externally in the explicate realm. Now, one of the things that's going to happen, of course, in the biblical narrative is that form moves from external forms like biological bodies or planets or ecosystems into internal forms. And we will talk about internal form when we get into the enfolding or transforming process in the biblical narrative, because this is where form then begins to relate directly to human consciousness. Up until the human, you did not have self-reflective beings who had worldviews, which are forms. You would not find a group of wildebeests having this particular discussion, because while they can think, they can't think about thinking. They cannot be reflective in their thinking, and they do not make decisions based on choices of reflective thinking. Their thinking is always directly related to their instincts. We are also animals of instincts. We have God-given instincts. They have a role and function. So we do experience the realm of form through instinctive, biological, God-given existence, but we also have the ability in our minds to have consciousness that allows for growth, and that growth can only come through a transforming process. So Paul will say, don't be conformed, be transformed. How? The renewing of your minds. It's a consciousness issue for Paul. And we'll see that that theme is all through the biblical narrative. And again, it overlays perfectly with what we are seeing in the story of science. When we get to Jesus, Jesus also, in terms of the informing, attributes everything to source. And that's why Jesus said, the words that I speak are not my own. The information I'm conveying, says Jesus, is not my informing. It's not my information. Well, whose information was it? In the work of Jesus, he clearly came to show that everything came from source. So when he uses the term Father, he's simply using a term that they would have understood as the source of identity. Source and identity go together. Now, Jesus used Father because in his Jewish culture, genealogy and therefore family identity was determined by the patriarch. It was a patriarchal system. But Jesus was coming with not just an informing message, but an informing message that was pointing to a transformative result, a transformative result that was going to take humanity from explicate order of things like ethnicity, race, gender, into that which transcends all of those forms and therefore is aligned with the implicate order or the God order or the God consciousness of formlessness, whereby our identity transcends all forms. So that is where we're headed into our study. So this will also involve spiral dynamics. We're going to get into it as well later as we go along in this, and I'll show how it really is part of the enfolding or transforming process. So we're going to get to it. But at the end of the day, what we're showing here in our study is that there is a biblical cosmology that overlays beautifully with the story of the universe. And so I will pick it up here the next time, and I'm back. I will pick it up here next time, and I will continue on showing how the Holomovement is actually another word for Christology, or Christology could be used as Holomovement. This is not true with the current interpretation of Christology as a religious form, because the Holomovement is not form. It's inform to transform. And therefore, we're saying when you read the biblical narrative and you're looking at those two things, informing and transforming, you'll quickly see that Christology is aligned with the Holomovement and not the 2,000-year-old religion that has led us to a place in time, as I've said before in some of these past episodes, where people are leaving churches, seminaries are having difficulty keeping their heads above water, 18 to 30-year-olds are not going to mom and dad's church, they're not going to the grandparents' church. The greatest and fastest movement in the West is spiritual but not religious. And so, what are we to make of this? What we're saying is it's time for us to look at the way the story has been told. It's been told in thousands of different ways, all of them related to a specific minority of people who have taken a label upon themselves to say this is God identity, and the rest of you all in the world are not. Then, even worse, you get inside Christianity and they start arguing amongst themselves. Well, that's not the true church, or that's not true Christianity, or what you're teaching is not correct teaching of what Christianity really is, and on we go. And that's why it's failing. People have grown tired and weary of that old little God story. So until the next time, Um, we will continue on with our series, and I appreciate everyone tuning in for that, and I'll look forward to seeing you then.